I wait 12 hours in the recovery room before I realize that once again, my family has forgotten I exist. And this time, I might actually die from the complications they're too busy to notice. The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed flicker with the same mechanical indifference that has defined every major moment of my 24 years as Chen Meilin, unwanted daughter of the Chen pharmaceutical empire. And as my throat begins to close from what I now recognize as anaphylactic shock, I understand with crystalline clarity that my family's pattern of systematic neglect has finally become literally life-threatening. The surgery was supposed to be routine, just a small procedure to remove some scar tissue from a childhood accident that, naturally, no one in my family had been present for either. But something went wrong with the anesthesia, something that could have been prevented if anyone had bothered to provide my complete medical history. If anyone had cared enough to answer when the hospital called 3 times, asking about genetic predispositions and drug allergies that I was too unconscious to provide myself. Instead, my father Chen Wei-ming was busy finalizing the merger that would expand Chen Pharmaceuticals into the Myanmar market. My mother Li Yazi was orchestrating the charity gala that would cement her position as the premier socialite philanthropist of our city. And my golden child brother Chen Mingyang was celebrating his engagement to Judge Lu's daughter at the exclusive Riverside Club. The same engagement party that had been deemed too important for any of them to leave when the hospital's first emergency call came through. I know this because I can see Ming Yang's phone buzzing on the visitor's chair, see the 17 missed calls from the hospital staff, see the text message from our father that reads, "Handle Meilin's situation quietly. Today is too important." And I understand now that I was never really their daughter, just an obligation they've been trying to fulfill minimally for 24 years. A reminder of the business crisis that nearly destroyed Chen Pharmaceuticals the year I was born, the daughter they never wanted, who somehow became the symbol of everything that had ever gone wrong in their otherwise perfect lives. The pattern started early, so early that I used to think it was normal for children to wait until midnight for parents who never came. Normal to pack my own lunch and walk myself to school. Normal to celebrate birthdays alone with whatever cheap cake I could buy with my allowance, because everyone else was always too busy with something more important than remembering the day I came into the world. I was 7 when they forgot to pick me up from school for the first time, left standing in the empty playground until the janitor found me and called the police. And when my parents finally arrived, they were furious, not with themselves, but with me for causing a scene and embarrassing the family name. As if a 7-year-old child could be responsible for her own abandonment. The hospital visit started early too, because I was always a sickly child, always catching whatever was going around, always needing medical attention that seemed to come at the most inconvenient possible moments for my family's busy schedule of social climbing and business building. When I was 10 and needed emergency surgery for appendicitis, they were at Ming Yang's college preparatory interview. When I was 16 and broke my arm in 3 places during a school field trip, they were at a business dinner with potential German investors. When I was 22 and my car was hit by a drunk driver, leaving me with a concussion and internal bleeding, they were celebrating Ming Yang's engagement announcement at the country club. Always something more important, always someone else's needs taking priority over their daughter lying alone in a hospital bed. But this time feels different. This time feels final. Because as my airway continues to constrict and my blood pressure drops and the monitors around my bed begin to sound increasingly urgent alarms, I realize that their neglect has moved beyond emotional damage into actual physical danger. That their inability to spare even 5 minutes for their daughter's medical emergency might actually kill me. And the nurse who finally rushes in looks panicked as she explains that they need my family medical history immediately. That there's some kind of severe allergic reaction happening, but they can't treat it properly without knowing what specific drug allergies run in my family. Information that is sitting in my parents' medical files at home while they sip champagne and celebrate their son's bright future. I try to call them myself, my hands shaking as I dial numbers I've memorized from a lifetime of reaching out to people who never reach back. But every call goes straight to voicemail, every emergency text is marked as read but never answered. And through the haze of medication and increasing oxygen deprivation, I can hear the medical staff outside my room discussing whether they should just start treating me empirically, whether they can afford to wait any longer for family authorization, whether my next of kin can really be so completely unreachable during a medical emergency involving their only daughter. That's when I overhear the conversation that changes everything. when I hear the head nurse explaining to a doctor that she spoke to my family's secretary and was told they cannot be disturbed for minor complications, and that any medical decisions should be handled with minimal disruption to today's schedule, as if my life is nothing more than an administrative inconvenience, as if the possibility of their daughter dying is just another item on a busy agenda that can be dealt with later when more important things have been completed. The final insult comes when Ming Yang finally arrives, not because he's worried about his sister, but because the hospital threatened legal action if someone didn't come to sign medical liability waivers, and he walks into my room still wearing his expensive engagement party suit, still smelling like champagne and success, and the first words out of his mouth are not concern for my condition, but irritation that I've created this drama on his special day, that I couldn't have timed this better or handled it more discreetly without involving lawyers and threatening the family's reputation. He pulls out a stack of legal documents that I recognize immediately as medical liability releases, papers that would absolve the family of any financial responsibility for my medical care, papers that would legally declare me responsible for my own emergency medical expenses, while simultaneously removing my inheritance rights since irresponsible individuals shouldn't have access to family assets. And as I read through the carefully worded clauses that would essentially disown me financially while keeping me legally bound to protect their reputation, I understand that this isn't negligence anymore, this is calculation. This is a family systematically severing their connection to a daughter they never wanted while ensuring she can never become a financial burden or social embarrassment. The lawyer's language is clinical and precise, describing me as a family member with a history of medical instability and recurring healthcare costs that could impact family business operations, language that transforms 24 years of genuine medical needs into character flaws, language that makes my childhood illnesses and accidents sound like deliberate attempts to drain family resources, language that rewrites the story of my life to make my parents' neglect sound like reasonable financial planning and my need for medical care sound like selfish manipulation. As my oxygen levels continue to drop and my vision begins to blur, and the medical machines around me sound increasingly desperate alarms, I sign those papers because I understand now that I have no choice, that my survival depends on releasing my family from any obligation to keep me alive, that the love I spent 24 years desperately seeking was never available, and that my continued pursuit of it has literally brought me to the edge of death. And as consciousness starts to slip away from me, I have one final moment of perfect clarity where I understand that I spent my whole life trying to earn love that was never available to me, and now I'm dying because they couldn't spare one phone call to save their daughter's life. The last thing I remember is the heart monitor's steady beep becoming a long, flat tone. The last thing I see is Ming Yang checking his phone for messages instead of watching his sister's vital signs flatline. The last thing I feel is the profound loneliness of dying in a room full of medical equipment but no family. No one to hold my hand, or say goodbye, or even witness the moment when Chen Meilin finally stops being a burden to the people who were supposed to love her most. Then I opened my eyes and realized I was back in the recovery room, and this time I knew exactly what I needed to do. The clock on the wall shows exactly the same time it showed 12 hours ago in my previous life. The same fluorescent lights flicker overhead with the same mechanical indifference. The same post-surgical weakness makes my limbs feel heavy and disconnected, but everything else is different because now I have the knowledge of what comes next. Now I understand the complete pattern of neglect that leads to my death. Now I can see clearly that my family's systematic abandonment isn't accidental or circumstantial, but deliberate and calculated, designed to minimize their obligations while maximizing their control over my desperate need for their approval. The phone beside my bed is ringing with the same urgency it rang with before. The nurses outside my room are having the same concerned conversations about missing family medical history. The same allergic reaction is beginning to constrict my throat and spike my blood pressure. But this time, instead of calling my family over and over like a desperate child begging for attention, I reach for the hospital admissions paperwork and quietly change my emergency contact information, replacing my father's number with the one person who has never once failed to show up when I needed him. Dr. James Harrison has been my neighbor since childhood, the boy next door who walked me to school when my parents forgot, who brought me birthday cake when my family was too busy to celebrate, who visited me during every hospital stay and remembered every medical detail that my own family couldn't be bothered to retain. The man who became a pediatric surgeon partly because he understood what it felt like to see children abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect them. And when I call his number instead of my family's, he answers on the first ring with immediate concern in his voice, asks no questions about why I'm calling him instead of my parents, simply says he'll be there in 10 minutes, and that he's bringing my complete medical history from the files he's kept since we were children. The transformation is immediate and profound, because within minutes of my call, James arrives with not just my medical records, but also his medical bag, his hospital credentials, and the kind of calm, competent presence that makes the nursing staff immediately relax, makes the attending physician nod with relief, makes everyone in the room understand that finally, Chen Meilin has someone who treats her medical emergency like an actual emergency instead of an inconvenient interruption to more important plans. He knows my medication allergies better than I do, knows the genetic predispositions that run through my family's medical history, knows exactly which treatments will help and which might harm, and as he works with the medical staff to stabilize my condition, I feel something I haven't felt in years, the sensation of being truly taken care of, the knowledge that someone competent and caring is handling my crisis with the seriousness it deserves, the relief of finally having an emergency contact who actually responds to emergencies. The irony isn't lost on me that a pediatric surgeon who isn't even my family knows more about my medical needs than my parents do. That the neighbor boy, who has no legal obligation to care about my welfare, treats my health crisis with more urgency and competence than my own flesh and blood. That the person I should have listed as my emergency contact years ago was always right next door, waiting patiently for me to stop banging my head against the wall of my family's indifference and turn toward the door that had always been open. As my breathing stabilizes and my blood pressure returns to normal and the immediate danger passes, I realize that this simple change, this quiet rebellion of updating my emergency contact information, is actually the first step towards saving my own life. Because if I'm going to survive, I need to stop pretending that people who systematically abandon me are somehow still my safety net. Stop waiting for care from people who have spent decades proving they don't care. Stop setting myself up for disappointment and danger by relying on people who see my needs as inconveniences to be minimized rather than crises to be addressed. The next phase begins immediately because while James handles my medical care with the competence my family never provided, I begin systematically disconnecting myself from their systematic neglect, starting with all the legal and financial entanglements that gave them power over my medical decisions, that made me dependent on their approval for my own health care, that kept me trapped in a cycle of abandonment because I had no legal right to seek care from people who actually cared about keeping me alive. I call my lawyer first, a woman I've known since law school who has always been quietly horrified by my family's treatment of me, but respected my repeated requests not to interfere. And when I explain that I want to take complete control of my own medical decisions, want to remove my family's authority over my health care, want to establish independent medical power of attorney and insurance beneficiaries, she doesn't ask questions about my sudden change of heart, simply begins preparing the paperwork that will make me legally responsible for my own survival, instead of legally dependent on people who can't be bothered to insure it. The insurance changes are straightforward but symbolically profound, because when I remove my family as beneficiaries and medical decision makers and replace them with James and my lawyer, I'm essentially acknowledging what has always been true but what I've been too desperate for their love to admit. That my actual support system has never included my biological family, that the people who would responsibly handle my affairs if something happened to me are not the people who share my DNA, but the people who have consistently shown up for my life. The financial independence comes next, because I've always had access to my trust fund, but I've never used it strategically, never understood that my financial dependence on my family was actually a weapon they could use to control my behavior, to keep me grateful for scraps of attention, to make me feel obligated to accept their neglect because they were supporting me, even though the money was legally mine and they were just managing it in ways that kept me psychologically dependent on their approval. When I liquidate my trust fund and move the money to independent accounts that only I control, when I remove my family's access to my finances and establish my own investment strategies, when I hire my own financial advisors who work for me instead of for my family's overall wealth management strategy, I feel the strange sensation of becoming financially adult at 24, of finally taking responsibility for my own economic survival, instead of accepting whatever allowance my family deemed appropriate for their disappointing daughter. The stock manipulation comes naturally because, as a minority shareholder in Chen Pharmaceuticals, I've always had more power than I realized. Power that my family encouraged me not to use, because business decisions should be left to people who understand them. But now that I understand that my family's business success has always been more important to them than my actual survival, I see no reason to continue supporting a company that views my medical emergencies as inconvenient disruptions to their profit margins. When I sell my shares at a strategically chosen moment, just before the quarterly earnings announcement that I know will disappoint investors, I'm not just liquidating assets for my own independence. I'm also ensuring that Chen Pharmaceuticals' stock price will drop significantly, that my family's net worth will decrease substantially, that their business operations will face the kind of financial pressure that forces difficult decisions about priorities and resource allocation. The same kind of life and death priority decisions they've been forcing me to navigate alone for my entire life. The professional separation is equally important because I've held a token position at Chen Pharmaceuticals since graduating medical school, a meaningless job that gave my family something to point to when people asked why their daughter wasn't more involved in the family business. A position that provided no real responsibility or authority, but did give them the ability to claim they were training me for eventual leadership while actually ensuring I remained completely dependent on their approval for my career advancement. When I submit my resignation letter, professionally worded but definitively final, explaining that I'm pursuing independent medical practice opportunities that better align with my career goals, I'm not just leaving a job I never wanted. I'm publicly declaring that I don't need my family's business empire to build a successful life, that I can create my own professional identity without their connections or their name, that their systematic exclusion of me from meaningful roles was actually a gift that forced me to develop independent capabilities they never bothered to recognize. The social withdrawal is the most visibly dramatic change because my family has always required my attendance at various social functions, charity galas, business dinners, family celebrations, events where my presence served as evidence that they were a complete, functional family unit rather than a business partnership that happened to include an unwanted daughter they couldn't quite figure out how to discard without social consequences. When I stop showing up to these events, when I politely decline invitations to charity auctions and merger celebrations and family holiday gatherings, when I make it clear that I'm no longer available to serve as a prop in their performance of family unity, the reaction is immediate and revealing because suddenly my family members are calling me more than they have in years. Not because they miss my company, but because my absence makes them look incomplete, makes people ask uncomfortable questions about where Chen Meilin is and why she's not supporting her family's social and business activities. The phone calls are illuminating because for the first time in my life, my family is actively seeking my attention. But it's not because they've suddenly realized they love me. It's because they need me to continue playing my role as the grateful daughter who shows up to smile and applaud their successes, who provides evidence that they're worthy of respect and admiration, who ensures that no one looks too closely at their actual parenting record or wonders what kind of family dynamic produces a daughter who never seems genuinely happy at family celebrations. When my mother calls asking what's wrong with me lately, why I seem distant and uncooperative, I give her the same polite, minimal responses I learned from years of receiving polite, minimal attention. And when she becomes frustrated with my failure to provide detailed explanations for my behavior changes, I simply say that I'm focusing on my own priorities right now and that I hope she understands. Language that mirrors the dismissive responses I've received from her for decades, whenever I needed more attention than she was willing to provide. The real test comes with Ming Yang's engagement party, the same event that in my previous life was deemed more important than my medical emergency. The celebration that they couldn't interrupt, even when their daughter was dying alone in a hospital room, and when the invitation arrives with a handwritten note from my mother explaining how important it is for the whole family to be present for this milestone moment. I understand that this is my opportunity to publicly demonstrate how completely my priorities have changed. Instead of attending the party, I arranged for a medical courier to deliver a package during the toasts, a package containing complete documentation of my previous night's medical emergency. Hospital records showing the timeline of emergency calls that went unanswered. medical staff reports documenting the family's refusal to be disturbed for minor complications, and a brief letter explaining that I was unable to attend the celebration because I was busy arranging independent medical care after nearly dying from complications that could have been prevented if anyone in my family had been reachable during a medical emergency. The documentation is clinical and factual, containing no emotional language or accusations, simply medical records that speak for themselves. Records that show exactly what my family's priorities were when their daughter needed life-saving medical attention. Records that demonstrate with scientific precision the difference between claiming to love someone and actually being willing to leave a party to save their life. The impact is immediate and devastating because, while I'm not present to witness the reaction directly, James calls me from the hospital where he's working a late shift to tell me that my mother has been frantically calling the medical center asking for clarification about the documentation, that my father's secretary has been demanding to speak with whoever was responsible for this misunderstanding, that several prominent families have apparently called to express their concern about Chen Pharmaceuticals' family values and what that might mean for their business practices. The scandal spreads through our social circle with the viral intensity that only the very wealthy can generate when they discover genuine moral outrage. Because while rich families might overlook financial impropriety or minor social embarrassments, they cannot ignore the abandonment of a child during a medical emergency, cannot accept the prioritization of business celebrations over life and death family crises, cannot maintain social relationships with people who treat their own daughter's survival as less important than maintaining party schedules. The business consequences are swift and comprehensive because when you run a pharmaceutical company, when your entire professional identity is built on the idea that you understand the importance of medical care, when your marketing materials emphasize your family's commitment to health and wellness, you cannot afford to have documented evidence circulating that shows you prioritizing merger celebrations over your daughter's anaphylactic shock that proves you consider emergency medical situations to be minor complications that shouldn't disrupt important business events. The regulatory scrutiny begins within days because health authorities who were already monitoring Chen Pharmaceuticals' expansion into international markets suddenly become very interested in the company's internal culture, very concerned about whether a business that treats family medical emergencies as administrative inconveniences can be trusted to properly prioritize patient welfare, very curious about what other minor complications might have been handled with minimal disruption to important business schedules. The partnership dissolutions follow quickly because my connections from medical school, colleagues who always respected my clinical competence, even while privately questioning my family's treatment of me, suddenly feel ethically obligated to reconsider their institution's relationships with Chen Pharmaceuticals, suddenly find themselves unable to recommend business partnerships with a company whose leadership has documented patterns of medical neglect, suddenly discover policy conflicts that prevent their hospitals and research centers from continuing collaborations with my family's business operations. When my father finally calls me directly, for the first time in months, his voice carries a tone I've never heard before. Not the dismissive irritation or polite indifference that usually characterizes his rare communications with me, but genuine panic, actual fear that his business empire might crumble because his systematic neglect of his daughter has become public knowledge in exactly the professional circles where his reputation determines his success. He offers me everything, promises me executive positions and increased inheritance and public acknowledgement of my contributions to the family. But his desperation only confirms what I already understood, that his concern isn't about repairing our relationship or acknowledging the harm he's caused. It's about damage control, about finding some way to restore his professional reputation without actually changing the fundamental dynamics that led to this crisis, about getting me to fix this without him having to admit that there was ever anything that needed fixing. When I tell him that I'm simply prioritizing my own survival now, using the same language he's always used to justify prioritizing business over family, using the same tone of reasonable practicality that he's always employed when explaining why my needs had to wait for more important considerations. He doesn't recognize his own words reflected back to him, doesn't understand that I'm treating our relationship with exactly the same strategic calculation that he's always applied to his interactions with me, doesn't realize that I've learned to view his emotional needs as minor complications, that shouldn't disrupt my own important business of staying alive. The final stroke comes when I open my independent medical practice, specializing in pharmaceutical safety and patient advocacy, building a professional identity that directly contradicts everything my family's business represents, creating a career that positions me as an expert in exactly the kind of medical negligence that nearly killed me, establishing myself as someone who helps people navigate medical emergencies when their families are too busy or too indifferent to provide adequate support. The symbolism is perfect and the business model is sound because there are many people who need independent medical advocacy, many patients who require professional assistance navigating healthcare systems when their families are unable or unwilling to provide adequate support. Many situations where someone needs a competent, caring medical advocate who will prioritize their survival over maintaining social schedules or business priorities. My first major case involves a pharmaceutical safety consultation, where a company's internal documents reveal patterns of prioritizing profit margins over patient welfare. Documents that remind me uncomfortably of my family's approach to prioritizing business success over their daughter's medical needs. And when I help expose the company's negligent practices, I feel the deep satisfaction of using my expertise to protect other people from the kind of systematic abandonment that nearly killed me. The media attention that follows establishes me as a respected expert in medical ethics and pharmaceutical accountability, someone who understands both the clinical and personal sides of medical neglect, someone whose professional credibility is enhanced rather than damaged by my family's public scandal. Because my survival and success despite their abandonment proves my expertise in navigating medical crises independently, proves my ability to build supportive professional networks when family systems fail, proves my competence in protecting myself and others from the kind of medical negligence that my family's business practices enabled. When the medical journal publishes my first research paper on family medical abandonment and its impact on patient outcomes, when I'm invited to speak at conferences about pharmaceutical ethics and patient advocacy, when my independent practice becomes financially successful enough to completely eclipse my previous dependence on family wealth, I understand that my rebirth wasn't just about surviving my family's neglect. It was about transforming that survival into expertise that could help other people avoid the same life-threatening abandonment, about using my second chance at life to ensure that other people don't have to nearly die to understand that their family's love might be conditional on their convenience. The transformation is complete when James proposes to me on a quiet evening when I'm reviewing case files for my growing practice, when he tells me that he's been waiting years for me to realize that I deserved someone who would always answer when I called, someone who would always show up during emergencies, someone who would never consider my medical needs to be inconvenient interruptions to more important plans. And when I say yes, I understand that I'm not just accepting a marriage proposal, I'm accepting the idea that I deserve to be with someone who treats my survival as a priority rather than an obligation. Our wedding is small and intimate, attended only by people who have consistently shown up for my life, people who celebrate my happiness without requiring me to minimize my needs or apologize for my medical history, people who understand that real love means being available during emergencies, means answering phone calls when someone needs help, means treating the people you claim to care about as if their lives actually matter more than your social calendar or business schedule. The final update on my family comes through social media and business publications rather than direct communication, because by now we exist in completely separate worlds. Their world of desperate damage control and declining business prospects, my world of growing professional success and genuine personal relationships built on mutual care rather than biological obligation or social expectation. My father's early retirement is announced as a strategic transition, but everyone in our industry understands it as the inevitable result of his public reputation for prioritizing business over family. His inability to restore confidence in a pharmaceutical company led by someone who couldn't be trusted to prioritize his own daughter's medical emergency over a party schedule, his failure to demonstrate the kind of ethical leadership that health industry partnerships require. My mother's removal from various charity boards is presented as her stepping back to focus on family, but the social media whispers make it clear that she's been quietly disinvited from the kind of high society functions where her presence would remind people of uncomfortable questions about family values and medical neglect, where her attendance would force other wealthy families to confront their own potential for abandoning children when business opportunities conflict with parental obligations. Ming Young's broken engagement is officially attributed to different life goals, But James, who still hears gossip through his hospital connections, tells me that Judge Liu's family couldn't risk associating their daughter with someone whose family had documented patterns of medical abandonment, couldn't afford to suggest that their future grandchildren might be raised by people who consider emergency medical care to be optional when business celebrations are scheduled. Their financial situation stabilizes eventually because Chen Pharmaceuticals doesn't completely collapse, but their social and professional influence never recovers. Because in industries where trust and ethical reputation determine success, where business relationships depend on confidence in your character and judgment, where people need to believe that you'll prioritize important things appropriately, you cannot survive documented evidence that you abandoned your dying daughter to attend a party, cannot rebuild credibility after proving that your family's medical emergencies rank lower than your business celebrations. The pregnancy announcement comes 2 years later when my practice is thriving and my marriage is strong and my life is built on foundations of mutual respect and genuine care, rather than desperate attempts to earn conditional love from people who were never capable of providing it. And when I call James from the doctor's office to tell him we're going to have a baby, he leaves his own patient consultations to come celebrate with me, drops everything to share this moment, because that's what people do when they genuinely care about each other. When they understand that some news is too important to wait, when they prioritize the people they love over the convenience of their schedules. As I sit in that same hospital where I nearly died from my family's neglect, where I learned to save my own life by changing my emergency contact, where I discovered that real safety comes from connecting with people who actually respond to emergencies, I put my hand on my growing belly and make a promise that this child will never wonder whether they're wanted, will never wait alone in a recovery room for people who are too busy to answer emergency calls, will never have to nearly die to understand that their survival matters to the people who claim to love them. This time, my child will never wonder if they're wanted because from the moment they're born, they'll be surrounded by people who show up, people who answer phones during emergencies, people who understand that love isn't a performance you give at convenient times, but a commitment you honor, especially when it's difficult, especially when other things seem more important, especially when someone's life depends on your willingness to prioritize their welfare over your own convenience. I finally learned that family isn't who shares your blood, but who shows up when you're bleeding, who answers the phone when you're dying, who treats your survival as more important than their social schedule, who loves you enough to be inconvenienced by your needs, who understands that real care means being available during the worst moments, not just the celebrations. Who knows that being someone's emergency contact means you actually respond to emergencies, no matter what else you had planned, no matter who else is expecting you, no matter how important those other things seemed before someone you love needed you to choose between their life and your convenience. And when my child asks me someday why we don't see their grandparents very often, why there are no pictures of their father's childhood family at our family gatherings, why their emergency contact forms list people who aren't blood relatives, I'll tell them the truth, that sometimes the family that raises you isn't the family that claims you, that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who choose to love you rather than the ones who are obligated to love you, that sometimes being born into a family means nothing compared to building relationships with people who actually show up when you need them, people who understand that love is measured not in what you say during the good times, but in what you do during the emergencies. People who know that being someone's family means you protect them when they're vulnerable, not abandon them when their needs become inconvenient. That's the story I'll tell my child, the story of how their mother learned to save her own life by finally understanding the difference between the family that raised her and the family that actually cared, whether she lived or died. The story of how sometimes you have to nearly die to realize that the people who were supposed to protect you were actually the ones putting you in danger. The story of how changing your emergency contact can change your entire life because it forces you to finally acknowledge who would actually show up in an emergency and who would send you to voicemail because they have something more important to do than keep you alive. And most importantly, it's the story of how I learned that you don't have to spend your whole life waiting for people to love you the way you deserve to be loved, because there are people out there who already know how to love properly, people who understand that caring for someone means being available when they need you. People who know that family is something you build through consistent actions rather than something you inherit through accident of birth. People who will answer the phone when you call, who will show up when you're scared, who will choose your survival over their convenience every single time without hesitation, without resentment, without keeping track of how often you've needed them or whether your timing is good for their schedule. That's what real love looks like. And that's what I'm going to teach my child from the very beginning, so they never have to learn it the way I did, nearly dying in a hospital room while waiting for people who were never coming, people who had already decided that a party was more important than their daughter's life, people who taught me the most valuable lesson I ever learned, that sometimes saving your own life means quietly changing your emergency contact and then building a completely different life with the people who actually answer when you call.
I have one of her stickers on my very bottle. She made the fuck ice and abolish ice stickers. Yeah, you can buy them still, by the way. Procrastinating is the art method I practice. Sandwiches, please. It's an incredible name. Prince Freddie. Thank you for the follow. And worked with QTC, yes, and just sold 1,000 fuck ice stickers to QTC, from what I heard. Liz is incredible, doing amazing, amazing, amazing work. An incredible painter. I highly recommend. If you don't follow Liz already, you certainly should. Oh, and a small Yahoo. Coco, Kaylee. Yeah. 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 Couple of Yahoos for you. Thank you for the hype train, sweet angels. Yes, I paint